What's up guys? My name is Javier and welcome back to Tool Crates. So in today's episode, we're going to take a look at the multi-purpose miter saw from Evolution, the Evolution Rage 3 10-inch sliding miter saw. Now, before I go over this miter saw, let's talk about miter saws in general. So today's miter saws, they're excellent in cutting wood, and technically they can cut other stuff such as various types of plastics. But what if you need to cut metal? Then you're going to need to go out and buy a metal cutting tool such as a metal cutting circular saw, a chop saw, a reciprocating saw with a metal cutting blade, or like many make do with an angle grinder and a metal cutoff wheel. Also, what if you need to cut tile? Then you're going to have to go out and buy even more tools such as a large stationary wet tile saw, a handheld tile saw, or manual tile cutters. So that's where the Evolution Rage 3 comes in, as it's not only a standard 10-inch sliding miter saw that's well suited for wood, but it can also make fast, smooth cuts into metals with its included multi-purpose blade. So with the included blade, you can make cuts into wood and metals, and even wood with metals. And then let's say you need to cut something like tiles, stone, or concrete. You can also make those cuts with this same miter saw, but you'll need a separate diamond blade to do this. Now, going back to its metal cutting performance, many people such as myself can get by with a grinder for making small, quick cuts into metals, although it's not very fast with a grinder, but for my uses, it's all that I need. But if you do lots of work with metal and you need to make cuts often, you're probably going to want to go with a dedicated metal cutting machine. I've tested out this machine, and it does a fantastic job at cutting metals, although I'm not exactly sure if it has mostly to do with its metal cutting blade or with the machine itself. The thing is that metal cutting saws are designed from the ground up to the specifications for cutting metal. I suppose you could slap on a metal cutting blade on a regular miter saw, but I wouldn't recommend it because a regular miter saw is not designed for cutting metal, even with a metal cutting blade. You'll end up putting a lot of stress on the motor, which could lead to premature failure. But looking at the specifications for this miter saw, it does have much slower RPMs than what you would find on other miter saws. Normally when you're working on metals, you want to go at slower speeds for the additional torque and so that you don't burn out your blades. And the same thing goes with drilling and drill bits. So over here on this saw, it tops out at 2,500 RPMs, when most other wood cutting miter saws range between 4,000 to 5,000 RPMs. So this leads me to believe that this miter saw is designed to be a metal cutting saw that's also designed for cutting wood and just about everything else. It also has a few features that are designed with metal cutting in mind, such as this unusual shield right here in the back. So on other miter saws, they're designed so that the wood chips fly through the back, they bounce off this shield, and they go up through the dust chute that should be in this area. But not on this saw. Instead, it has a shield right here, preventing the dust from going back. And not only that, there is no dust chute in this area. Instead, it's much higher up top at the motor assembly. So the reason that this shield is right here is so that when you're cutting metal, all the debris flies back and it hits this shield and it bounces downward instead of having metal shards fly all over the place. It also has a beefed up lower blade guard that's made out of metal instead of the usual plastic found on other miter saws. And also, unlike other miter saws, it's a solid design that covers the entire right side of the blade, making this saw more in line with what you would find on other metal cutting circular saws. So the reason for the beefed up blade guard is because when you're cutting metal, metal tends to chip and fly everywhere, so they beef up the lower blade guard so as to protect the user from chips flying all over the place. So before we dive any further into its performance, let's talk about what type of miter saw this is. It's a 10-inch sliding miter saw, so this means that it accepts a 10-inch blade, and instead of having only the fixed up and down chopping position, it also slides forward and back, so it can make much wider cuts than a fixed miter saw. And this gives you a maximum cutting width of almost 12 inches. So it's a single bevel saw, meaning you can make bevel cuts to one direction only, as it only bevels to the left side. So do you really need a dual bevel saw which can bevel to both the left and to the right? Well, not really. The truth is that a dual bevel saw makes life much easier, as it can bevel to both sides to give you a bevel cut to the left side and give you a bevel cut to the right side without having to flip the board over. But you can still get by with a single bevel miter saw, as you can still make the bevel cut on the left side, and if you want a bevel cut on the right side of the board, you can still do it, but you'll have to flip the board around to make both types of bevel cuts. And the back fence is rather short, so don't expect to be able to cut larger boards standing up, as you only get a 3-inch max height cutting capacity for standing boards. This also means that you'll have to make 2 cuts to cut 4x4 lumber. With a cut on one side, then you'll have to flip the board over and follow it up with a second cut. You also get the usual miter detents on the base of the saw for all the popular angles. And it goes all the way up to 46 degrees to both sides of the saw. The markings show up to 47 degrees, but the saw can really only go up to 46 degrees before it can go any further. And as far as accessories go, you get 2 material support extensions that go on the sides of the saw to help support longer work pieces. Although for very long pieces, you're going to want to use the built-in extensions from the miter saw stand. Then it also comes with a material clamp, and you only get 1 of these, but you can use it on either side of the fence. Then it comes with a multi-purpose metal and wood cutting saw blade. One thing I did want to mention is that this miter saw uses a 1-inch arbor for blades. The reason I wanted to point this out is because that most saw blades use 5/8 inch arbors, so let's say you want to use a nice Diablo blade, then you're pretty much out of luck as most use 5/8 inch arbors. But that's not to say you're completely out of the dark, as Evolution has several saw blades using the 1-inch arbor, and some third-party brands also have 1-inch arbors. And moving on with its features, this also has a built-in laser to help line up your cut line with the blade, which I'll touch into more detail in just a bit. And let's not forget about the standard dust collection bag that all miter saws come with. And this bag fits over the back of the miter saw right here. And this port also doubles as a vacuum port, so you can connect your vacuum to reduce the amount of dust that flies all over the place. Evolution also includes a vacuum adapter port. And they also include a plug that fits over this vacuum port. And the reason for this is so that when you're cutting metal, the metal chips don't fly out through the back or through here, and instead they hit the metal chip deflector and they go straight down safely. The built-in cord is probably one of those things that nobody ever thinks about when they're making a purchase for a new power tool. But the cord that comes included with this saw is a little bit on the short side, coming in at 5 feet. Now, the size of the cord really isn't a big deal if you're working outdoors, as you're going to be using an extension cord anyways. But if you plan on using this saw indoors, unless you have your power outlet right next to the saw, you're going to need to use an extension cord. So if you don't have an extension cord already, now's the time to buy one. And another thing that I wanted to share with you guys was the fact that this saw was not ready to go out of the box. What I mean by that is that you have to put the saw together before you can even start using it. When I opened the box, I was greeted with the sliding rails on the top portion of the styrofoam, along with the blade and some accessories. Once I removed this top piece of styrofoam, I found the rest of the miter saw as another 2 pieces, which included the metal base and the motor and blade mount. The motor mount was on top of the box, so that was the next thing to remove so I can get to the base of the saw at the bottom of the box. And lastly, I took out the base of the saw. One thing that surprised me after picking up the metal base was that it was very light. I mean, it was so light that I was able to pick it up with only 2 fingers. So after I had everything out, I laid everything onto my work table and you can see all the main components side by side. Of course, I wanted to test out the saw immediately, but as you can see from the 3 major components next to each other, that I needed to put it all together. Now, this is completely different from the other miter saws that I purchased in the past, as they all came fully assembled out of the box. And what I don't like about this is that, let's say your previous saw just broke down in the middle of the job, and you had to go out and purchase a new one. You'd expect it to be ready out of the box so you can keep on working, but that's just not the case with this saw, as you're going to need to spend some time to put the whole thing together, which ultimately means more downtime from the job you're working on. So then the next portion is to install the sliding rails onto the back of the base. And this whole thing is color coded, so you'll want to line up the rail with the red tip with the red arrow, and the white tip with the white arrow. And after that's installed, you'll want to mount the tightening knob. This knob allows the rails to slide, or you can tighten the knob to keep the saw from sliding. The next step is to install the motor onto the rails, and this step is pretty straightforward. Once again, the rails are color coded, but at this point it's pretty hard to screw up unless you mount the motor upside down, which nobody's going to do that. And a simple push of the motor into the rails is all that's needed, and you'll hear a click when the rails snap together with the motor mount. And the click wasn't very loud, so I wasn't sure if I did this part correctly, so I made sure to slide the rails back and forth to see if the motor would fall out, but sure enough, it was installed correctly the first time. And next on the list is to secure the power cord on the back of the base behind the rails, and this is done by installing a thumb screw attached to a clip and tighten. And after that's done, you can then install the blade. Just don't forget to install the blade using the provided hex key to tighten the blade. Then you can install the included accessories such as the material clamp, and this goes on either side of the saw just behind the fence and is held on by a thumb screw. Next, I install the material support extensions, and these simply go into the sides of the base into 2 slots. And after you install them, you need to tighten them by using the supplied hex key to tighten the onboard screw on top for each extension. And along with the side extensions is a material stop plate that you can slide onto the rails of the side extensions. And what's good about this is that you can use this as a stop for when making cuts, so you can make repeat cuts of the same length on several boards. But the only downside is that the extensions aren't very long, so you can only use a stop block for making repeat cuts on short boards. The next step is to install the dust collection bag over the dust port if you're going to be cutting wood, or use a vacuum port with a vacuum to reduce the amount of dust that flies into the air. Or if you're going to be using the saw for cutting metal, make sure to install the plug into the dust port. So at this point the saw is ready to go, but before I go out and use the saw, I wanted to check how good the blade alignment is out of the box. So then I got my square to see if the blade is square to the fence at 90 degrees. And out of the box, the accuracy is actually quite good, surprisingly. It's not exactly a perfect 90-degree angle, but extremely close. Maybe like 89.5 degrees. And here we can see that the front of the blade is touching the square, while there's a tiny gap in the back. I wanted to get it perfectly squared, so I adjusted the fence screws in the back, and I got the blade squared up perfectly. And here's what it looks like after I squared up the blade with the fence, and notice how the blade is making good contact with the square front to back. And the next alignment check you want to do is to see if the blade is square at the base. And once again, out of the box, it's nearly perfectly aligned. It actually looks like it's perfectly squared, but if you look closely, there's a very slight angle. So you can better see this, let's zoom in on the gap so you can see what I'm talking about. The top of the square is touching the blade while there's just a slight gap towards the bottom of the blade. Now, for most uses this is good enough and you'd be fine working under these tolerances, but again I wanted to get a perfect square. Also, getting it perfectly squared up is a way to go if you'll be doing miter cuts such as picture frames and you want a perfect joint. I didn't get any footage of getting this squared up to show you guys, but it's very simple and all you have to do is adjust the screw in the back where the bevel scale is. And the last step to set up your new Rage 3 miter saw is to set up the laser alignment with the blade. The thing about the laser is that it shows you where the blade is going to cut. And if your laser line is off, then your cuts are going to be off. That is if you rely on the laser. So to set up the laser, they include this template that's called the laser alignment jig. You're supposed to place this on the base where the blade will cut, and you use it to line up the laser with the cut line. But before you can use a template, you have to make a few cuts on either side. Then you have to cut the opposite end off, then fold these 2 tabs, then fold this bottom section and place it so it stands up with the flaps toward the back. At this point you place a template on the base and line it up with the fence. Now, the problem that I found was that the template slides through the bottom of the fence instead of resting next to it. And after fiddling around with it, I found out I was wasting my time and I decided to toss it as it wasn't helpful. I had a better idea of how to set up the laser so it was aligned correctly. First I made sure to clamp a piece of 2x4 securely to the base and to make a cut. I didn't want the cut to go all the way through. What I wanted was just to make a shallow cut so I could see the cut line of the blade. And after the cut was made, here we can see that the laser is not aligned correctly out of the box. It's close to the cut line, but it's off slightly to the side of the cut in my case, and this will definitely not do. But there's no need to worry as this is an easy fix. All you have to do is adjust a couple of screws near the laser to get it aligned perfectly for accurate cuts. I made sure to line up the laser so that it fell inside the crevice of the cut line from the saw. And just to test out the accuracy, let's first make a test cut. So after the cut is made, the laser line falls directly inside of the cut line. But one thing that I noticed about the laser line was that even though you can get the laser to line up accurately with the cut line, was that as you lower the blade to make a cut, the laser line moves to the side. So that by the time the blade makes contact with the material, the laser is off by a good amount to the right of the blade. So for this reason, I'm going to say that the laser works, but it's just not as nicely as the XPS LED lighting system that you would find on some of the DeWalt miter saws. And another thing that I want to share with you guys is that there's a pretty good delay when you press the trigger and when the saw starts spinning the blade. It's not like on other saws where you press the trigger and bam, the motor starts up instantly. I noticed that Evolution calls the blade startup a slow start, but honestly it takes 2 seconds to get going. I actually thought that this saw was defective the first time that I started it up, but as it turns out, there's nothing wrong with this saw and that's just the way it is. But luckily the more you use the saw, the more you get used to it to the point that it's no longer a big deal. So before I headed to my backyard to do some serious testing, I mounted this saw to my miter saw stand and I noticed a slight issue. As I started to tighten the bolts holding the saw to the stand, I noticed that because the saw has a set of rubber feet at the edges of the base, it was twisting the mounting bracket as you can see here. If I keep tightening them as I did, I'm going to end up breaking the brackets on the stand. So my solution to mounting the saw to the stand was to remove the 4 rubber feet that holds up the saw. It's an easy fix as the feet are held on by a single screw that needs to be removed on each foot. Then with the feet out of the way, I mounted the saw on the stand flat on the brackets, and with the feet out of the way, I was able to fully tighten the mounting screws without bending the mounting brackets. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and test out this bad boy to see what it's fully capable of. So we already know that this can cut softwoods as I showed you with a few cuts on the 2x4 to line up the laser. But the real question everyone wants to know is, can this saw cut a 2x4 with nails? Well, let's go ahead and find out. And as you can see, it went right through the wood as if it had no nails at all. Actually, that was just a warm-up exercise for the saw so it could stretch out its muscles. So now let's move on to something a bit more difficult. Here I have a piece of square tubing, and as you can see, it's a thick piece of tubing with 1/4-inch thick walls, but let's make this metal cutting even more difficult with the addition of some angle iron. It's not nearly as thick as the square tubing, but pretty close, and here goes the cut. So it starts off very smooth and with a great pace, but I had to stop because I was getting metal chips flying at my face and my arms. I was already wearing safety goggles, but if you're going to be using this saw to cut metal, make sure to wear a long sleeve shirt and a face shield. And here goes round 2 of the metal cutting match. And the cut continues smoothly and at a nice pace, just as it did in round 1. And looking at the cut quality, it came out very nice as the cut finish is very smooth. There's none of that weird metal discoloration that you find when you use a grinder, but instead you're left with a sort of a glossy finish. And also notice how there's very little burrs left over from the cut. This is all thanks to the included multi-purpose blade that leaves a great finish on metal. Although the cut finish is very clean, you'll still want to handle it with gloves on so you don't cut yourself on the few burrs that are left behind. And another thing that's great about the included blade is that you get cool cuts when you cut metal. Usually the metal being cut is not much hotter than when you start, and you're able to touch the metal with your bare hands immediately after you make cuts. For example, here I'm going to make a cut on the square tubing from the last cut, but before I do, let's take a temperature reading with my FLIR C2 thermal imager. And before we even make a cut, the temperature reads as 98 degrees. The reason it's so hot is because we're in the middle of summer out here in my backyard, and it's about 98 degrees outside. So now let's make the cut, and we'll see how hot it gets after the fact. So after we got our cut made, let's get another temperature reading, and the temperature only went up a few degrees as it's now 104 degrees, so the temperature only went up hardly anything. But one thing to note is that the smaller piece that was cut off got significantly hotter, as we can see that it's 113 degrees. Okay, so moving on to some more stress testing. Let's do a thick plate of metal. And finally, a huge I-beam. Obviously this is taller than 3 inches, so we're going to have to cut this in 2 passes. So here's the first pass, and I was actually surprised at how deep it would cut. It actually seems like it would almost go all the way through in 1 pass, but just with a tiny smidge left over. Not to worry, as we'll get the rest of it on the second pass. First I have to flip the piece over and make sure I have the blade lined up with the first cut. And we're off again. So as we can see here, it can handle a large I-beam. And luckily for you guys, I also have the Evolution 10-inch diamond blade that's going to allow you to cut tile for your next flooring project. And diamond blades can also cut stone like granite, marble, slate, and any other natural stones. and it can also cut concrete and bricks. I do want to mention that there's 3 types of diamond blades you can get. A smooth diamond blade, then there's a segmented blade, and also a turbo diamond blade. The one I have here is a continuous smooth diamond blade, which gives you the cleanest cut out of the 3 types of diamond blades, but is also the slowest. If you're looking for speed, then the segmented diamond blade offers the quickest cut into tile or stone, but they tend to leave a bit of tear out, so use these when you need to cut fast, but you're not worried about the finish quality. And then there's turbo blades that are mixed between smooth and segmented diamond blade, so you get a bit of both worlds, but not as smooth of a cut as the smooth blades and not as fast as the segmented blades. Another thing I want to mention about this saw is that it's not a dedicated tile saw. As you can see from the cuts, you can see that it's a very capable saw for cutting concrete and tile, but it can only make dry cuts. And what this means is that you're going to be making lots of dust as you make cuts into tile, stone, or concrete, so be prepared to make a mess, and I highly suggest you make all of your cuts outside like I did in my backyard. If you don't want dust all over the place, your best bet is a wet tile saw that wets the blade and the material being cut and practically eliminates dust from flying all over the place. There was one thing that I noticed about this saw while it was mounted on the miter saw stand, which is that it wasn't able to reach all the way to the left or all the way to the right to make 45-degree miter cuts. And the reason for this was that the mounting brackets of the stand were in the way. But that's really because this saw didn't take these into consideration, as this block at the bottom of the plastic grip gets in the way. You could put the rubber feet back on, but then you run into problems and the potential to ruin your stand mounting brackets. I found a better solution. So what I did was made a set of 4 supports that would elevate the saw on the mounting brackets, but yet still allow the saw base to be able to swing all the way to either side so you can reach those 45-degree miter angles. I cut out 4 thin scraps from a 2x4 and drilled a 1/2-inch hole, but made sure that the hole was near the edge of the supports. And as I installed them, I made sure that the front supports were set at an angle so that they didn't get in the way of the swinging arm of the base. And this little fix was almost free, as I already had plenty of spare 2x4 pieces, and all I had to go out and buy was longer carriage bolts for the added length of the 2x4 supports and a few extra washers and nuts for the bolts. So that pretty much wraps up all of its performance testing, and as we can see from all the tests, this saw was very capable at just about everything that I threw at it. And personally, I thought it would do a great job at cutting metals, which it did, but I thought it was going to be a slouch at cutting wood because of the much slower RPMs. But as we can see, that just wasn't the case, as it had excellent performance even when cutting hardwoods. It also performed very nicely at cutting concrete and stone, and it cut much faster than I expected it to. Although, because it only makes dry cuts, expect a ton of dust to fly around everywhere, so make sure to do all your tile cutting outside. And the accuracy was very good out of the box, as we can see. And unless you need dead-on precision, I'd say that you really don't need to make any adjustments out of the box. But that was the case with my saw, and your results may vary. So you might want to double check the accuracy on your saw with a square. And as far as pricing goes, this is a $200 miter saw. And as far as quality goes, this is a $200 10-inch sliding miter saw. And it fits right in there with other brands such as Cobalt and Ryobi. I guess what I'm trying to say is that don't expect this saw to have the same quality and finish as, let's say, a DeWalt, a Bosch, or a Makita miter saw. So at $200, I think it's a good value, especially when you consider that you're getting a miter saw and a metal cutting circular saw. Plus you also get that multi-purpose metal cutting blade included. Metal cutting blades can get pretty pricey, so it's nice to see that they included one with this saw. Although there were a couple of things that I wasn't crazy about, as you have to remove all 4 rubber feet if you want to mount this saw to a miter saw stand. And also that you can't make 45-degree cuts with this saw when it's mounted to a miter saw stand and all 4 feet are removed. But as you can see in this video, I was able to find a fix for this issue with a quick and easy fix. Then there's also the fact that this saw uses a 1-inch arbor, meaning that you won't be able to use any 5/8-inch arbor aftermarket blades out there. And personally, I like using Diablo blades because they're inexpensive, they're easy to come by, and they offer excellent performance for the price. But seeing as those blades use 5/8-inch arbors, well, we're pretty much out of luck for using those blades with this saw. And there's also quite a selection of other brands that also use a 5/8-inch arbor. But sadly enough, we won't be able to use those blades with this saw. But that's not to say you won't be able to find any saw blades that use a 1-inch arbor, as Evolution has a nice selection of blades to choose from. And there's also a few other brands that also use the 1-inch arbor, but those are going to be harder to come by. Alright guys, I hope you guys enjoyed this review. Show your support for this channel by liking this video, subscribing if you haven't done so already, and following me on Facebook, Twitter, and Google+. And if you guys are interested in purchasing one of these saws, I left you guys a link in the description below so you guys can check it out. And with every purchase you guys make, help support this channel so I can make more videos and more tool content for you guys. And also don't forget to check out the Tool Craze website at www.toolcraze.net for more tool news, tool deals, and even reviews you won't see here on this channel. Such as a review for this FLIR C2 thermal imager that you guys seen in this video. If you guys would like to know more about it, check out the Tool Craze website. And I also left you guys a link in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.